5D Chess with Multiverse Time Travel by Connor Peterson and Thunkspace LLC just released to Steam on July 22nd, at the time of recording, yesterday. Since this is a somewhat complicated game and it doesn't include an in-game tutorial, I thought that I would make one, in hopes of helping you better understand the game and how the different pieces move. In order to understand 5D chess, first we'll need to understand the different dimensions or axes that the player is able to interact with. The third dimension, or z-axis, being height, is not interactable and therefore can be completely ignored. Yes, I know this means that it makes it really kind of 4D chess rather than 5D chess. This still leaves us with 4 axes that the player can interact with though, 2 physical axes and 2 temporal axes. The physical axes are the x and y axis. This is left to right and up and down on a traditional board. There are then the 2 temporal axes. The first is what I'll refer to as the time axis, and this is the past and future of a board. The second are the parallel dimensions, or timeline axis. There are some similarities between these 2 groups of axes, and the x-axis on the traditional board roughly corresponds with the time axis of a single board. The y-axis on the traditional board roughly corresponds with the dimensions or timelines axis. This will become relevant later as we discuss how some of the pieces move. Next up is the rook. The rook can move any number of spaces along a single axis. In traditional chess, this means it can move any number of spaces along the x or y axis, but not both at the same time. When we include the additional axes provided by 5D chess, this means that the rook can move any number of spaces through the timeline or time axis. However, it can't do both at the same time, and it won't move on the x or y axis if it does so. As you can see, the rook will stay in essentially the same place on the x and y axis as it moves backwards through time or across different timelines. The next piece that we'll be looking at is the bishop. The bishop can move an equal number of spaces in exactly 2 axes. On a traditional board, this means that it could move 1 space to the left and 1 space up, 2 spaces to the left and 2 spaces up, etc. However, because of the additional axes provided in 5D chess, this gets somewhat more complicated. We select this and go to the stack view. You can see that this bishop can move the 1 space on the timeline axis and then 1 space on either the x or y axis, allowing these 2 spaces. It can further move 2 steps on the timeline axis and then go 2 steps on the x-axis to land here. This goes in any 2 directions. This includes going 1 space in the timeline axis and then 1 space in the time axis, landing in the exact same x and y position that it was in when it started. This means that when moving through the time axis or the timeline axis, the bishop moves orthogonally through just the x or y axis. This may seem strange to players used to the bishop moving diagonally, but it's something that you'll get used to over time. The queen is a very powerful piece, something of a combination between a bishop and a rook. The queen can move any number of spaces along any number of axes, so long as the number of spaces moved is equivalent on every axis that the queen traverses. In traditional chess, this means that the queen can move any number of spaces on the x or y axis, or the x and y axis, so long as the number of spaces moved on the x and y axis are equivalent. This means that it can move diagonally like the bishop. However, with the additional axes added in 5D chess, this gets a little bit more complicated, but not terribly much. Just stick with me here. The queen can move backwards 1 space in time, and forwards 1 space on the x-axis. If the space was open, it could also move on the y-axis as well. If it goes back 2 spaces in time, it can move 2 spaces on the x-axis, the y-axis, or the x and y-axis, assuming that those spaces are available. Now the queen can also move across the timeline axis and the time axis and the y-axis, as we see here, as long as each step is only 1 step. Now, if If the queen wants to go further than that one step, it has to again do so on every axis that it traverses. So it could go one more step on the timeline axis, one more step on the time axis, and one more step on the y-axis. Now the king, the piece that you are desperately trying to protect, moves very similar to a queen, except that it can only move one space on any of the axes that it travels. If we look here, you can see that the king can move on the x-axis, the y-axis, the x and y-axis, the x, y, and time axis, or the x, y, timeline, and time axis, as long as it's only moving one space on each axis that it travels. Now, the knight is an interesting piece and has unique movement even in traditional chess. In traditional chess, the knight moves two spaces on one axis and one space on a different axis. Notably, the knight can jump over another piece or two if they're in their way. This movement pattern continues into the additional dimensions. As you can see here in this shape, the knight is moving two spaces along the time axis and then one space along the timeline axis. It can also move two spaces along the time axis and then one space in either the x or y direction. As you can see, this gives the knight a lot of flexibility and also the ability to continue jumping over pieces just as it did in the traditional chessboard. This makes knight movement somewhat tricky to predict, as it can land in a lot of different boards all around it, and not necessarily ones that are just a single direction off of it. It's worth noting that the knight can move two spaces on the x or y axis, and then one space on the temporal axis. This opens up a lot of interesting plays around avoiding enemy rooks or queens. As you can see here, the knight can move two spaces on the y-axis and then one space on the time axis. This allows us to stay on the same y-axis that we were on and avoid the enemy rook here that was covering this whole y-axis that we might have been forced to move into if we didn't go back in time. And finally, we come to the pawn. What might seem like an inconspicuous piece is actually a little bit complicated in 5D chess. Traditional chess, a pawn can move one space forward and one or two spaces forward if it hasn't moved before. With the additional axes, this means that the pawn can move forward through different timelines, but not into the past. This is because this direction is considered forwards and this direction is considered sideways. Similar to how we discussed earlier that the x-axis is comparable to the time axis and the y-axis is comparable to the timeline axis. The pawn can move forward through the timeline axis because that's comparable to the y-axis that it's normally able to move. So since it can only move one or two spaces along that single axis, the pawn's x and y position won't change when it moves forward through timelines. However, pawns move a little bit differently when they're capturing pieces. As you can see, in traditional chess, pawns capture diagonally, that is, one space on the x-axis and one space up on the y-axis. In the additional axes provided by 5D chess, a pawn can capture one space up or along the timeline axis, and then one space to the left or right on the time axis to make its diagonal movement. It can move here or here. Of note, the pawn is not moving on the x or y axis when it does this, so it's capturing a piece that's in the same position that it was in a different timeline in the past or future. Because the pawn can only capture by going forward on the y-axis and over on the x-axis in traditional chess, it can only capture in 5D chess going forward on the timeline axis and over on the time axis. This means that this pawn over here could never capture a piece backwards in the timelines. If I deselect, you can see this visual layout where forward and up is this direction in the timeline axis. It will never be able to capture a piece this direction. Well, that about covers it for how each of the individual pieces move in 5D chess. However, it's going to be important that we address the different timelines that we've been touching on earlier. As we talked about in the pawn movement, this pawn is able to interact with another timeline in the past. If this pawn were to take this rook, we haven't really discussed how that'll actually happen, just that it's possible. In this demonstration, the pawn from the future in a different timeline is going to go back in time into an alternate dimension and take this rook. If we do so, you can see here that the pawn will leave the timeline that it was originally in to go to another timeline, and that timeline will then split to create a new timeline in which the pawn took the rook. Play will then continue on this timeline, as well as the timeline that the pawn left and the timeline that the pawn entered. Notably, the rook that was taken by the pawn in this timeline does not disappear in that timeline's future. It simply splits off to create a new timeline. Another important thing to talk about when discussing interacting between timelines is that not all timelines are necessarily active. Timelines with a purple arrow are active timelines. Inactive timelines are indicated by a white or black arrow corresponding to whichever player created that timeline. Players go roughly back and forth creating new timelines, and if one player creates more timelines than the opponent has, some of those timelines will be inactive until the opponent creates more timelines. If we undo the move that we just made that was creating a new timeline, you can see that up here, white has made a move that branched off and created a new timeline. Because white already had created more timelines, as you can see here, this would be their third timeline compared to the only one of black. That timeline was inactive and then essentially frozen. Black could choose to interact with that timeline if they found it advantageous, but if they didn't, white has to wait until black starts creating more timelines to make it active. Now if we go back and proceed to take the rook that we were going to take, you'll see that it creates a new timeline, which is active, and also activates this timeline up here. You'll also notice that the present, this little indicator here, gets pushed back to the farthest back active timeline. Note that before we made this move, the present was up here, indicating that we were still playing around up here, and this was frozen. As this timeline becomes active, it then becomes the present, and play will have to continue from here. Players are allowed to interact with any future timeline if they choose to. However, they don't have to. They only have to keep the present timelines all played. This means that if, for example, white has moves that they're able to make in some of the future timelines, they can essentially freeze that board while they're playing in the present and then come back to it later. Black will have to wait for white to make a move before they can make a move on those future boards. As you can see here, black and white have both made some more moves, progressing the present and the future. You'll note that black has available moves on these 4 boards, but not on these boards. That's because white chose not to make moves on them because they're in the future, and that's optional. White can wait until it's advantageous for them to make a move, and black will have to wait to progress that timeline. There is one notable exception to the rule that we've seen previously about how moving to a different timeline creates a new branching timeline. This exception is that if you were taking a piece from a timeline that you currently have a move in, such as white having a move in this timeline, and you move that piece to another timeline that you currently have a move in, such as this timeline that white also has a move in, instead of creating a new branched timeline, it will simply consume your move on both timelines, progress them one step. As you can see here, if we take this white's knight, move it up to this other timeline that we currently have a move in, what will happen is that it will progress both timelines by one step. You can't do anything else on this timeline. You've used your move for it, but you've not branched off and created a new timeline that you'll have to deal with. This opens up a lot of interesting strategies about denying opponents' timelines and about keeping your board a little bit more consolidated. The last thing that we need to discuss before you can run off and start playing on your own is about checking and checkmating the king through time. As you can see on this board, white has put back into a pretty standard check. Normally, black would be able to move the king up, so that way the queen is no longer putting the king in check. However, if we try and do this, we'll notice that there's a problem. We get this big red border and arrows. What you'll see is happening is that the queen is actually putting the king in check through time as well. The queen would be able to go back in time to the previous history of this single board and take the king here, or to this alternate timeline and take the king here. Because of this, you can get some really gnarly time, dimension, check, and checkmate conditions. This is especially important because if you're attacking a king back in time, the king can't move to respond to that check. That makes it much easier to get checkmate on a past king than a present king. This just about covers all of the basic rules of 5D chess. Notable exceptions are castling and en passant, which are standard chess rules, and if you're interested in those, you should be able to find relatively useful guides directly from traditional chess websites. At this point, you're ready to begin your own journey in exploring 5D chess. This is also the point where I have to tell you to like, comment, and subscribe if this video was helpful. And if there's any other tips or tricks that you would like, please let me know and I'll do my best to help you out. Thank you.